There were some really rocky times.
What'd you learn from these times?
I learned that most people don't know about your failures unless you tell them.
CEO and co-founder.
Joe Lonsdale is the founding partner of ABC.
Palantir co-founder, Joe Lonsdale.
I knew Andrew Yang as a fellow entrepreneur and as somebody who helped a lot of entrepreneurs around our country. That's something we have in common. And even though he and I don't fully agree on politics, it was awesome to see him jump in as a builder, to get involved in our political system, to put forward some great ideas for how to fix things and build things in our country. Andrew's empowered entrepreneurs all around our country. He's shaken out the Democratic establishment. What's he going to do next with the Forward Party? Really honored to have our friend Andrew Yang here with us today. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here, Joe. American optimist indeed.
Andrew, many people know you from the Yang Gang, from your viral presidential run. You accomplished some pretty amazing things. But I want to start with one of the pivotal moments earlier in your life. After Columbia Law, you landed at a prestigious firm, but you quit the law firm after only 5 months to go become an entrepreneur. How did that happen?
Someone said something to me a while ago that I thought was good advice. It was try and find someone who has the life and career you want, and then work with them and support them. And what I found at this law firm was that I was getting better at a job I didn't want. And just those two things being true, we're like, all right, I guess I should leave then. So I left to start a failed.com at its mini rise and maximum fall. And my Asian parents weren't that pumped about this set of decisions.
Your parents were immigrants who came over from Taiwan, is that right?
Yeah. My dad got his PhD in physics. My mom got her master's in statistics. So you can imagine how nerdy that household was. So they weren't really down with the entire leave the cushy law firm job story. But I said, don't worry about it. I'll figure it out. And then ended up eventually, as you know, becoming head of an education company. But that was a number of years later. So I got to say that was like some stressful years for mom and dad Yang.
do you feel like was it a good thing to go through having a failed startup? A lot of startups fail. You ended up broke with all these loans. Does that make you stronger in some way?
Yeah, I became a party promoter during that time. I did some different things. And there were a few years there where I genuinely felt kind of bulletproof. I said, well, this can't be as bad as when my company died. And then even after that company, I went to another company that ran out of money in the wake of 9/11. So there were some really rocky times.
What'd you learn from these times?
I learned that most people don't know about your failures unless you tell them. And I joke in one of my books, I said, no one knows you have a net worth of negative 100,000 unless you tell them. And you hopefully keep that to yourself. Because as you mentioned, I did have school loans at that time. So you realize a lot of it's in your head. And so if you can get your head working for you instead of against you, it's kind of a big deal.
And then you went on to crush it with Manhattan Prep. It was bought by Kaplan, I think, right?
Yeah.
And you did Venture for America. So tell us about these things that worked out that you built. Do you take some lessons from what you did and figure it out?
I still look back fondly on my time running that education company, because it was a private company and you just make very, very rational, pure decisions and you have no one to answer to. It's just like, look, if it helps the business, then let's do it. And if it doesn't, let's not. I met my now wife during that time. And so we joke all the time that it was like a bait and switch, because I was like a fairly normal, reasonable business executive at that time.
Now all of a sudden she has to be with a presidential candidate, huh? She didn't plan for that.
No, that's the bait and switch. My wife, so lucky, but she had no interest in anything political. And if I were to retrace my steps, I actually had a list of life's goals. And one of the things I definitely advise is just write down goals, because it magically helps you achieve them. But one of my goals was help elevate a national political figure.
Yep.
Because my thinking was, if I can find someone who do the right things in office, then they can do them and I don't have to. And it was not on my list to actually ever run for office myself.
That's how I think about it as well. My wife happens to be very interested in policy. I think today she's with Governor Abbott and Betsy DeVos on education policy while I'm here in New York. But she's like, do not run. That seems like it'd be terrible. But so you guys had to have a conversation and about that. Like how did that
Well,
work?
what's kind of funny, Joe, is that when I said, "Hey, baby, I'm thinking of running for president," she didn't take it that seriously. I think her exact question was of.
That's true. I think that's what Kimmy told me. She said to you too. My business partner at AVC. She's like, Kimmy, I'm gonna run for president. President of what?
Yeah. So because of that, it actually wasn't this soul searching, gripping, like, what are we gonna do? Are our lives gonna change? One thing I said to her, which was totally wrong, was I was like, she said, "Are we gonna lose our privacy?" And I was like, "Would you recognize Amy O'Rourke if she walked in, or Jeanette Rubio?" And she was like, "I guess not." And I was like, "There you go. You'll be fine."
it's you who loses and not her.
And I actually didn't even think anyone would recognize me, which is sort of bizarre given that I was running for president. But it was only after the first presidential debate in summer 2019 where I'd get recognized on the street, and then my wife would say, "I can't take you anywhere because anywhere we go, then
they all mob
end up
you."
with.
But for her and your kids, it hasn't been too bad. It's been a positive thing.
I'm very lucky that way. My kids did not care about anything I was doing. My wife tried to get them to watch the presidential debates, and they were like, "This shit is boring," and just like drifted off. so
great.
Like our family life is pretty similar, I'm happy to say.
And so from your end, you're an entrepreneur. You've got some successes. You're obviously an unconventional thinker or a risk taker. Like, how did that tie into building the cultures around you in these other areas now you're working on?
Well, thanks, man. So the intermediate step was I left Washington Post, which bought my company, to start a nonprofit venture for America, and you and I met during that time. So I marched around the country for 6 years trying to help entrepreneurs and startups and growth companies in Detroit, Cleveland, Birmingham, New Orleans. And so I saw the aftermath of the automation of manufacturing jobs, and then Trump wins in 2016. So I think, that's actually a result of these economic changes.
A lot of people who are struggling a lot and not being heard.
Yeah, and you and I work in technology companies, so you know that a lot of things are changing. You know what's not changing so much? Our political system.
Yeah, it's pretty static.
And so since I started Venture for America, I've had the opportunity to work with people who are genuinely purpose-driven. And I'm going to give you all an example, anyone watching this. The people who joined Andrew Yang's 2020 presidential campaign as staffers, think about that decision. It was objectively a bad decision.
Well, it could be a good decision even if you don't win.
Well, so the people who joined were all about like, okay, I think this is an important campaign because it's going to get a message out. It's going to advance certain solutions. But it wasn't wise professionally.
Well, it was unlikely you were going to win, but it was important the impact they were having.
Yeah. So because of that sort of motivation, you can imagine the people being very idealistic, very selfless, and not out for credit. So I've had the benefit of working in those sorts of organizations because I became a bit of a do-gooder at a certain point, and then the folks who've been working with me weren't going to make as much as they could make in other environments.
So that's a little bit different than some of the companies you were trying to build in the past, right?
Yeah, I mean, I look back very fondly in my time running a private business because you could reward people. If someone was good, you could be like, hey, like let's give you a promotion and a raise. You could organize a trip to a concert or a Knicks game or a ski resort, and no one gives a shit because it's like, whatever, you're your company, you can just decide to do that.
You do that on a campaign, it's more controversial, huh?
Yeah. So the trajectory is different. Where on a campaign, then people aren't trying to get a promotion, hopefully, like as their reason for being there. But then you feel immense pressure to actually try and accomplish whatever the campaign's goals were. It's a little bit similar to a nonprofit where your incentives are different. So I've worked in a lot of different environments. I do miss the small private business because, again, everything makes sense. And then in nonprofits, it's a bit of a hybrid, but there are a lot of people who are supporting your nonprofit because they believe in your mission. And so if you're a good leader, you're not like my way or the highway. It's like you've got myriad stakeholders.
Yeah.
And then a political campaign is that taken to an even further extreme where it really shouldn't be about you. It's about some vision or set of goals.
The broader goal for society.
Yep.
So one of the core principles you started the Forward Party now, so you've gone from being a Democratic candidate to an independent, and one of the core principles is bottom up, not top down, which I really like. That's a big part for high C society. What do you mean by that? You said you want to take rigid top down platforms and expect it to work everywhere. Like why did you come to this framework?
Yeah. So Right now, the national approval rate for U.S. Congress, what do you think it is? You probably know.
It's probably very low. It's probably like, I don't know, 12%. What is it?
It's 22%.
22. Well,
as of last month. So you're pretty close.
Still pretty low.
Yeah, pretty close. What is the re-election rate for individual members of Congress?
It's very high, I'd guess.
Yeah, it is.
Is it 80? What is it?
Very, very good guess. It's 94%.
Whoa!
Yeah,
even more extreme than I would have guessed.
Yeah, so it's a higher win rate than the Durant-era Golden State Warriors or the Jordan-era Chicago Bulls. And so you can imagine like the incumbents are like the best team you've ever seen than whoever's challenging them. So then you have to ask why this massive disconnect with a 22% approval rating and a 94% re-election rate. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that 90% of the congressional districts around the country are drawn to be either blue or red and are uncompetitive in the general.
The only real competition is from your own side, from the extremists on your own side.
Yes, which ends up distorting your incentives because to keep my job, I don't need to make 51% of the people in my district happy. I just need to keep the 10 to 12% most extreme, rabid, hyper-partisans happy, which looks very, very different than the mainstream.
That's why you see crazy policy on both sides sometimes. It doesn't work.
And what's even darker, Joe, is that a U.S. senator said this to me, and this is very important for people to understand. She said, an issue is now worth more to us unaddressed than addressed.
Yep.
Because if it's not addressed, I can get you mad, I can raise money, I can get votes. If I lean forward to address it, what happens? I get attacked as compromising with the enemy, ideologically impure. People won't be happy with the compromise I made.
This is the immigration issue. Is that the entire side not to solve it, especially
Marco Rubio is the example I use, where he stepped forward, 10, 11 years ago and said, hey, how about we have bipartisan immigration reform? And then a week later walks it back. Why? Because within that week, everyone in his party was like, Marco, what are you doing? Like, if we advance this thing, we're all going to take a beating. And so you have these distorted incentives that serve to perpetuate a set of political leaders while the problems get worse, not better. And this is in part because our country has essentially been divvied up by the two parties into red turf and blue turf. If you're in a rural area, 95% chance that it's Republican. If you're in a coastal city, 95% chance it's
so the incentives are all screwed up, and you guys are pushing for like ranked choice voting, of course, for nonpartisan primaries, independent redistricting. That kind of stuff's going to fix this a little bit, you think?
Well, so the best example, and by the way, if anyone really is into this, because I sense a lot of people who listen to you are really smart. So there's a book written by Michael Porter and Catherine Gale called The Politics Industry, which ended up guiding my thinking that I summarized in my book, which is that our political system's incentives are messed up. It's going to give us bad policy and polarization and dysfunction and people turning on each other by design. Because, again, you're listening to the extremes, then you get polarized by media and social media. And so the way out of this is to change the incentives. And you're like, okay, that seems pretty reasonable. So how do you do it in real life? What you do is you get rid of the party primaries and you say anyone can vote for any candidate in all candidate open primary. And then you choose among the top 4 or 5 candidates via ranked choice voting.
And that's going to make the extremes much less popular and less likely to win.
Yeah, because in ranked choice voting, you need to get to 50.1% in order to win. So they made this change in Alaska in 2020. And then this past cycle, you saw Sarah Palin lose to an Alaskan state legislator named Mary Peltola. But as important, and this got underrated by the press a lot. So the press was like, Sarah Palin, everyone knows who that is, let's talk about that. But what they didn't dig into was that Lisa Murkowski was the only U.S. senator who voted to impeach Donald Trump, who was also up for re-election.
And she was able to do it with this.
Because so check this out. It's important. So her approval rating among Alaskan Republicans plummets after she votes to impeach Trump. And we know that 8 out of 10 of the House Republicans who voted to impeach Trump didn't make it back even through the primary. So it is professionally suicidal to vote to impeach Trump. But in Alaska, there's no party primary. So then she comes and says to the general public, being like, hey guys, I'm my own person. And in a Republican primary, she loses. Yep. She was up against a Trump-endorsed challenger named Kelly Tshibaka. But there's no primary. So it just goes to the general public, and enough independents and moderates and Dems say, I like Lisa. And so she wins. And I'm going to take this a step further, is that do you think that the absence of the party primary actually made her more able to vote to impeach Trump? And the answer is yes. Yeah. I know that a bunch of Republican senators went to Lisa and said, I envy you that they made this change. So the change in Alaska cost $6 million in a ballot initiative in 2020. Yeah. The same set of changes was on the ballot in Nevada this past midterm, and it passed. So imagine a system where you just turn off the incentives that are polarizing us and making us more extreme and irrational, and rewarding people like Glenn Youngkin, as an example. Glenn Youngkin was chosen via ranked choice voting in the Republican nomination process in the Virginia party primary. So it sounds nerdy and wonky, but it's actually fundamental.
It's helping us get some more monarchs, more good leaders. You mentioned your book, by the way. The paperback just came out, right? Forward.
Yep, it's in paperback now. Made the bestseller list. Very exciting.
Congrats. No, I'm getting going on. I'm excited by it. Want to talk a little bit about like dysfunction in our country and like how we fix things. So I moved out of San Francisco because my wife didn't feel comfortable walking around the neighborhood. We thought it had gotten pretty dysfunctional, pretty disheartened to see in LA that someone I thought was going to be a person to fix it, wasn't able to beat the political machines in these cities. Like what's going on in our major cities? Like why are they broken? Like how should we be thinking differently?
So when you talk about the distorting incentives, so I ran for mayor here in New York City, as some might remember. 900,000 people voted in the Democratic primary that essentially decided who won. The population of New York City is around 9 million.
Yep. So you had 10% of people voted, basically.
10% of people voted, and that means the person who won might have literally gotten like 4% of the vote or something, along those lines. It was true of de Blasio too. So you have a political system that's really captured by folks who have the highest level of interest in the status quo very often.
Because the status quo actually, and I've been learning about this a lot recently, there's thousands of people who work in LA and New York and San Francisco paid by the city, and there's thousands more in NGOs who are all benefiting from the status quo. And in my experience anyways, a lot of people working for those NGOs will come out almost like a political machine, and they'll help someone get elected who they know is going to keep funding their NGO and their current way of doing things. So it seems like there's this like major insider game.
Yeah. There's a massive problem. And so when I was running for mayor here in New York, people would come up to me on the street and say, hey, Yang, like what you're about. I'd like to support you in your primary. And I'd say, thank you. Are you a registered Democrat? And they would say, no, I'm an independent or I'm a Republican. And then they'd say, can I vote in your primary? And I said, only if you have a time machine, because you needed to register as a Democrat 6 months ahead of time.
Wow.
And so then if you're a rational person, you're like, why would they make rules that make it so difficult for someone to participate? That is what we're trying to change with the Forward Party. Here in New York, you have one party rule. It's not working out, according to a lot of people. I'm going to suggest to anyone listening or watching, one party rule is just not great.
no matter which party it is. No matter which party it is.
It's just because most people watching this or listening to this are probably business types. And so we're accustomed to competition, bring out the best in organizations and decision making.
Yep.
Right now, 37 out of 40 states are one party states.
Yep.
So you have 3/4 where it's uncompetitive. And so the Forward Party wants to come to a place like New York and say, look, let's open up the system and make it so people have some more choices. We also want to do the same thing in a place like Missouri. It's funny, like, it's the way I see the world, but you have like a guts and systems and incentives problem. And what we're doing is we're personalizing all of it. We're like, you know what we need? We need a person to stand up and like do this. And it's like, no. You need someone to actually fix the mechanics.
So I want to ask a little bit more about policy because the Forward Party represent a lot of good ideas from things I've heard. One of the things I'm obsessed with on the policy side, the Cicero Institute, is we do accountability and competence in government. And we're passing a lot of laws, different states, to put in accountability, put in incentives, innovation. Have you thought about these issues a lot?
Yeah, man, that's core. You and I are totally aligned on this. And my fondest vision is that there's a dashboard in the halls of Congress that just shows how the country is doing. And then when a member of Congress shows up, they just pick a few of them and say, those are the ones that I want to see improve. Right now, there is no accountability.
There's really not.
And again, you have a 94% reelect rate. You're just there, and you can be a piece of furniture as long as you play the game.
What's amazing, we're working on this for like prisons. We probably all agree they should have like less recidivism, right, and more employment. We're working on it for vocational education. All these politicians talk about funding vocational education, which I agree with, but then you go to the schools and kids are failing. I don't know if you saw it, a few states, we changed the incentives where the vocational schools, they only got money based on the salaries of the students coming out, and so the salaries went up over 100%.
Wow.
Because all of a sudden they have to, do what's right.
By the numbers, we should be investing very, very heavily in vocational and apprenticeship. And one of the reasons we're not, have you had Richard Reeves on the podcast?
I have not.
He wrote a book called Of Boys and Men, and what he says is, look, vocational and apprenticeship programs disproportionately help men with high school educations. And that's great because it turns out that men generally are falling behind. You know that men are only 40% of college students.
I know
now?
it's all girls now, ladies, young ladies. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and so when you wind up with a lot of men who aren't going to college, and you don't have the apprenticeship or vocational training for them, then they wind up in very tough situations.
No, I think men are really underperforming. It's interesting in the top 1% of our country, for various reasons, but maybe some of them are inappropriate. Men are outperforming, but in the average, men are underperforming. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I see the same numbers.
You said we got to invest more in vocational education. I always see people talking about investing, but I never see them, or very rarely see them willing to like put on at the end of it, like, okay, we're going to tie the money to certain outcomes for these places.
I want to tie the money to the outcomes everywhere, man.
I'll talk to anyone from people on the moderate right to moderate left, and they'll tend to agree. I see especially the far left seems to be against accountability in government, maybe because they're tied to government unions where they're worried that if we put accountability, we're going to change things. Like it seems like that's a big problem right now where we have these special interests who are against accountability. Is this a battle worth having? And is it a really hard battle? Like, what do we do to get there?
Yeah, man. It's fundamental. So here, again, it's an incentives problem. Check it out. Let's say that I start a new program to help kids learn better. And then let's say 4 years later, it turns out the program's not working. Who gets rewarded by someone looking up and being like, hey guys, you know that program we spent $100 million on, or hundreds or billions? No results. Like, it's in no one's interest to raise their hand and be like, hey, the stuff we've been doing like wasn't good, or that person who attended the ribbon cutting or whatever the heck, like turns out there's no accountability in the system.
I feel like you get grumpy people on the right who sometimes do this. How do we get other, I mean, sometimes they're giving money the bad things that they did too. It's like how do you change the culture there?
Yeah, this is going to sound ridiculous, but to me, it's through reforms like nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting, because if you had an open system and it was more dynamic, and I had to come to you and say, look, reelect me, I need 51% of the general public to say things are actually working here. That's a much better incentive structure than, hey, I've got the 10% of hardcore, like
they're not going to like that. Yeah.
Like the hardcores, a lot of them, they have their bread buttered within the system in a particular way.
They really do. And they're getting paid off by it. So I want to ask about, you championed universal basic income during your presidential run. Where do you stand on that now? Are there some other underlying psychological or spiritual problems UBI can't solve? Is UBI still a big part of what you think is the solution?
Well, so when you talk about results, when you talk about facts, when you talk about data, 174 economists signed a letter saying we should keep the enhanced child tax credit that got passed as part of COVID relief in 2021. It brought something like 3 million kids out of poverty. The money categorically went to school supplies and food and things that like 174 economists were like, this is the best thing we've done.
Yeah, we love give more money to people with kids because it leads to better outcomes.
Yeah, it leads to better outcomes. And then unfortunately, because we operate in a society where results and outcomes are not the measuring stick, we took that away. I'm just someone who wants to invest in what's working and do less of what's not working. We're doing a lot of stuff that's not moving the needle.
And we're doing a lot of stuff that's crony too, right? I mean,
totally.
I build a lot of defense companies, but I look at like half the defense budget and it's like welfare for defense stuff. It's not even stuff that we need against our adversaries, which drives me crazy. So it seems like there's lots of things that we spend money on, but I'd much rather be giving it to people with kids, you know?
that's why, yeah, by the numbers. And here in New York City, we're spending something like $17,000 per student per year in the classroom, where we were when I was looking at the numbers. Actually, what I just said is I think too low. It might be like 30,000. So if you had 30 kids in the classroom, 30,000 a head, 900,000, you're looking around being like, where the heck's that money going? It's not going to the teacher.
No. And the administrators. Right?
But when you dig into it even further, Joe, what you find out is that it turns out that a majority of the kids' performance is determined by out-of-school factors anyway.
Oh, yeah.
By things like stress levels in the house and nutrition and the rest of it. So what we're doing is we're pumping more and more money into a poor functioning system. And then saying, why isn't it working? Why isn't it working? It's like, well, actually, the data shows that there are like a lot of other things that go into it.
Did you ever?
And then we close those schools for the better part of 2 years because again of like the cronyism.
Terrible policy. Did you ever follow Roland Fryer's education policy? He's an African American economist at Harvard. I thought it was fascinating. So he tested all these different things, like where to use the money best. And there's one thing is like people say smaller class sizes matter, and he tested all of it. And the thing he found in these poor inner cities that actually had the biggest impact was giving the kids money for better grades, which is very controversial. But I thought it was fascinating. If you made the kids care, then these kids actually do outperform.
Dude, they did something similar with folks coming out of jail for violent crimes, essentially saying like, hey, if you don't commit a violent crime, we'll give you a little bit of money.
That's aggressive, man. That works though, huh?
It apparently it was the most effective thing that anyone had thought of.
I mean, it costs so much to put someone in jail anyway. We should be thinking about that a little bit.
I mean, when you look at some of the numbers too, I mean, like we were spending. It was. I mean, it's been a minute since I had these numbers at the top of my tongue, but we were spending maybe $5,000 a month per homeless person here in New York City, and then you look at it and be like, wait a minute, that's more than rent for a studio apartment.
You might as well just pay for it. Yeah. No, and it's gone up. But the problem is there's a famous story in California where there's an apartment of Native Americans, whatever they called it, and they're spending, it turned out, like some insane amount of money, like $40,000 per Native American. And so people just looked at it and said, you know what, you could just close down that apartment and just give them the money. They'd probably be a lot happier. And of course, the 37,000 people working in the apartment were like, no, it's a horrible idea. But come on, like, who are you really helping here? I want to ask a little bit more about Venture for America. Tell us more about what you did there. What was that?
Oh gosh, man. So Venture for America was driven by my conviction that what smart people do matters. And so I went to Exeter, Brown, and Columbia Law. And what I realized from experience was that our smart kids in this country were doing one of 6 things in 6 places: finance, consulting, law, tech, medicine, or academia in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, LA, DC, Boston. And it was literally 80% of the intellectual products from these institutions were going to go to one of these 6 places and do one of these 6 things. And what I thought over time was like, well, it's going to be bad for Michigan, Ohio, Alabama, Louisiana,
we got to spread it
Missouri.
out.
We got to spread it out. So Venture for America, which by the way is still thriving today. So if anyone likes this idea, you can feel free to cut them a check. I mean, it's a C3. So what we do is we identify enterprising, ambitious college grads who want to learn how to build businesses and send them to work at startups in Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Baltimore, Birmingham. They work alongside the founders and the team for 2 years, helping it grow, develop their chops. And then at the end of it, they can, if they want to start their own business, we have an accelerator and seed fund to help them. So you can think of it as like Teach for America for entrepreneurship. That was what I spent 6 years building.
It's amazing. Well, part of the reason we moved to Texas is it's in the middle of a lot of different places I fly to all the time now, because I think America has been more successful at spreading things out a lot the last 5 or 10 years. So you could obviously contributed to that, which I appreciate.
Unfortunately, man, COVID contributed a lot of
that. Helped too. That helped.
It just spread out a lot of people.
And bad policy in San Francisco probably contributed too. But still,
I mean, I have a lot of friends. I've been to San Francisco. A Walgreens got robbed right in front of me. It was one of those things where you can't even just draw it up. Like I was in town for like a day. I walk into Walgreens, dude just steals, runs out with a bag full of stuff, and I'm like I freeze because I'm just like, oh shit, like this is unexpected. And then the person next to me just looks over at me and just says, San Francisco, shrugs. I mean, it's like,
there's a lot of missing leadership there we got to fix. So I work a lot on the policy for this, and I hope other cities don't follow their lead, because a lot of other cities are hiring the same people who ran these things in San Francisco, and that really concerns me.
Well, the tough part, again, is you don't have much accountability in the system, and people just vote with their feet like you and your family did.
Yeah. I fought it for a bit, but they demonize you if you speak against them too much, and you come close to having an impact. Then they try to make everyone think you're a bad person. So it's just no one wants to speak up and be attacked.
But you did see that people rise up in San Francisco to eject the DA.
Then they really have. And I have my old college friend from Palantir, also Gary Tan, and all these other friends.
Yes, Gary. I saw him when I was out there, and Gary stepped up. And Gary's the best type of activist where he had no desire to do it, but it was just like, I guess you had to do it.
You know what's funny? He and I would argue politics in our fraternity. We ended up working at Palantir together. I was more moderate right, he's more moderate left, but we became on the same side when it came to San Francisco, because we just got to fix it.
And that is what Forward's trying to do for the entire country. Is that you have, so if you were to oversimplify, but it's pretty accurate. So historically, Republicans have been the daddy party, Democrats have been the mommy party. But the Republicans have kind of taken on this crazy uncle energy.
Yeah, we do have some of that lately.
And the Democrats have become kind of the overbearing school marm energy.
Yep.
So like all the people in the middle who just want like positive functioning things are looking up being like, where's my home nowadays? And Forward wants to be home for those people to stand up to and say, you know why this seems so crazy is because the incentives reward craziness. It doesn't reward solutions and following the data.
I love it. Well, so Andrew, we started American Optimist to push back on some of the cynicism and pessimism we're seeing in our country. What are some of the reasons you're most bullish on America the next couple decades?
Well, I can see the path in things like getting rid of party primaries and switching to nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting, which passed in Nevada, despite the fact that both political parties came out against it. Think about that. And the first advertisement in that campaign was a military veteran talking to the camera saying, I went abroad, served the country, I'm an independent, and I can't vote in this system because they force you to register.
I love it.
And so everyday Nevadans stood up and said, hey, like that argument makes a lot more sense to me than what the parties were saying. And the parties, man, I was in Nevada campaigning for Question 3, which was his ballot initiative. $17 million was spent by folks who want to fix our democracy, including a lot of the people I work with. And then everyday Nevadans said, like, I believe that military veteran. I believe my own common sense more than I believe the two political parties telling me that it's too confusing.
It's an oligopoly. It doesn't want to be disrupted like every other oligopoly. Right?
And that's why I started Forward, is because there's no way to make it happen from within the system.
Yep.
Like the system will defend the system.
It will.
And so if you want to reform the system, you have to come outside of it, gather a bunch of patriots and energy and resources and smarts and say, okay, like we can defeat this system that is at this point, leading our communities in the wrong direction. And the people of Nevada raised their hand and said that we're with you.
And what would you say to young people? A lot of young people think the world's broken beyond repair. They're feeling very negative. Like, what would you tell those young people? How would you inspire them?
Well, first, I'd say that they're not completely off base and that we've left them a mess by the numbers. And we're going to need their help to clean it up. And it's not entirely fair, but that's just the situation we're in.
Yep.
And 2/3 of young people don't consider themselves either Republicans or Democrats. And so I think it can be very, very aligned with their perspective to say, look, let's reform this broken system.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, I think that's a great note to leave it on. Don't forget to check out his book, Came to Paperback Forward. Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure. It's great seeing you.